Sorry. Now, we can? Okay, now we can. All right. So, the meeting is being recorded. I think we need to have it done. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. This is our second talk of this AI and AU forum for this fall semester. And I'm very glad to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Shomir Wilson, from the College of Information Sciences and Technology at Penn State University. He's kind of a very famous person in terms of his research, as well as writing a lot of blogs for inspiring people. And kind of like, when you are having a bad time, just go to his website and read his writing, and you will feel good. So that helps a lot during graduate school. I'll just read out his bio because that's what my job is right now. So Shomir Wilson is an assistant professor in the College of Information Sciences and Technology at Pennsylvania State University, where he leads the Human Technologies Lab. His research interests span natural language processing, privacy, and computational social science. One of my students were asking, how is it connected to machine learning? It is connected in every possible way to machine learning, and you will see he's particularly interested in breaking down technology's walls of text, situations where a human reader is expected to consume a large quantity of text to take action against lacking time or expertise to properly understand it. Wow, looks like this is what I'm also trying to do. All right. He holds over 2 million in active grants from NSF, NIH, and other places, covering his research. And then he held postdoctoral positions in Carnegie Mellon University School of Computer Science, as well as University of Edinburgh's School of Informatics. He received his PhD in computer science from the University of Maryland in 2011. So here I give you Dr. Shomir Wilson. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that introduction, and thanks so much for folks inviting me here. Really appreciate being able to be here in person. So I'll get started. Before I get into the research, I want to tell you a little bit more about where I've been and some things I've done. So I joke with people that I could put together an entire athletic conference just based on universities I've been at. So I did some part-time classes at University of Mary Washington, and did undergrad, Virginia Tech, grad school, Maryland. That's where my PhD is from. At Maryland, I got into natural language processing for the first time. Didn't know about it as an undergrad, just thought, well, this looks interesting, and then adopted it. After that, I went and did something completely different. Got into privacy research, especially usable privacy research, trying to figure out how to build technologies to help people understand the choices about information sharing that they make in their day-to-day lives. Did some of that also at the University of Edinburgh, where I spent a different postdoc position at. First faculty position was University of Cincinnati, and I've been at Penn State. One reason I like to show this slide at the beginning of talks, though, in part to give some credit to the institutions where I've done work, in part to explain to you why I've ended up doing a bunch of different things, but also for students present, you can go on adventures. You can do this kind of stuff. Two that I skipped here, I spent a summer as a grad student at National University of Singapore and winter at Macquarie University in Australia. You can find grants to go do that stuff, and it improves your morale if you're into travel, which I am. Right. Speaking of students, though, I need to give a lot of acknowledgement to my lab, the Human Language Technologies Lab at Penn State. Right now, I've got 5 PhD students, Mukund, Pranav, Yunus, Tian Yang, and Shahryar, and 2 undergraduates, Grace and Juan. And this is a very old picture. This is back from height of the pandemic, when we were doing all of our meetings on Zoom. Haven't yet been able to get everyone in the same place for an updated picture. We'll do that eventually. But most, let's say nearly all of the work I'll show you today is due in large part due to these folks. I mentioned moving around a lot. I think that when you move your home from one place to another, you often get rid of things because you've got to move. Things are heavy. You want to fit everything into the truck. But when you move as an academic, the opposite happens. You accumulate more stuff, you accumulate more research. And a lot of that has happened to me. So preparing for this talk, this is actually an interesting exercise for me as a researcher. I made this Venn diagram, put together, we've got the green circles, natural language processing. There's a white circle here, privacy and security, picked that up at CMU. And then more and more in my work as a faculty member, I'm picking up bits of computational social science, because folks from across the university are coming to me with problems that deal with language data. And there's this growing acknowledgement that NLP could make a difference in a lot of fields. So I've been lucky to be in that area and to work with a lot of collaborators on a bunch of different problems. Some of this I won't be able to get to today because it is kind of a lot, but I will focus, I think, first on NLP on privacy policies and related texts. Then I'm going to tell you some about language model biases, and I'll give you a quick primer on how language models work if you're not familiar. And then I'll talk about some other things. I've got some vignettes that I want to share. Right. So that'll be the order I'll go about this. I also have lots of slides in an appendix. If we get to conversation later, then I'll be glad to show those too. So let's start talking about privacy then. In particular, text about privacy. It's the sort of text that people often don't read, but turns out to be really important for some reasons. And to frame this, I think we have to openly acknowledge something that's called the privacy paradox, this well-known thing in privacy research, where people say that they care about privacy. You ask them directly, yeah, I wish my data was under control. I wish I knew where it went. I wish I could not get all these targeted ads that make me feel creepy. Yet at the same time, when people make decisions with technology, there are these different outcomes that seem to happen. And so we as researchers have to resolve them. So here's half of that paradox. I gathered these headlines from a bunch of different sources. Look like one's Tech Radar and then USA Today, some other places too. And you can see these common patterns. First two are criticisms of Gen Z as behaving recklessly online and that they will live to regret it. Grr. You go back further, people have said the same thing about millennials. Millennials are indifferent about digital privacy and that they embrace sharing data with retailers. Golly, that's a hard statement. You can go back further than that and find headlines that are the same. So these kinds of claims, I show them to you because they suggest a difference, they suggest change, but the jadedness has always been there, and that should make us question the jadedness. And there is the other side too. People do seem to care about privacy though, because you can find plenty of these headlines too, where there are arguments for, there are arguments for privacy being a human right. That's been around a long time, but the way we discuss privacy has changed because the technologies that affect our privacy changed too. Whereas we didn't used to have phones in our pockets and IoT devices scattered throughout the room. So that's changed the conversation. People say sometimes privacy is dead, but long live privacy, because it evolves over time and our concerns change as we do want to share data in some cases, but we want more articulate control over how that sharing happens. Right. So if we talk about privacy and consumer privacy in particular, we have to talk about privacy policies. I put everyone on the same page. Here's a privacy policy of a typical website. This is from wired.com. And I'll give everyone just a minute to read this. Right. Right. So we're all done now. Who's read a privacy policy in its entirety? Has anyone done that? Has anyone? Okay. Looks like no. Did anyone say yes on Zoom?
Well, yes, but that yes came like 10 minutes ago, so not yesterday.
Okay. All right. So
we have two people back here from the Office of Compliance and Privacy in the university.
Oh, neat.
We're going to stay out of this conversation.
Okay. Okay. Well, glad to have you folks aboard, actually. I've got someone from Penn State's Privacy Compliance Office giving an invited talk in my privacy course later this semester, so appreciate your work. Find it engaging. All right, so yeah, when I ask that question when I give talks, it is pretty rare people raise their hands. And this goes on and on. This is the most text ever put on a slide. It doesn't all fit on one slide. So here's the second slide. And I think the situation is pretty clear to us that no one reads these documents. That's a problem, though, from a few different perspectives. You can start with the consumer perspective that even though this is presented in a totally unengaging fashion, there's pieces of information in here that people might make different decisions if they knew about. There are choices embedded in these documents, and I'll talk more about choices for consumer privacy later, about like 5 slides. There are pieces of information that sometimes really bother people. And our main mechanism right now for finding out about privacy outrage is actually news media. When there's a privacy scare, a company makes a change to their policy that's really alarming, news articles come out, they get social pressure, then maybe they change it back. That's kind of an indirect, not optimal route for the future of our information society. So the question is, can we do better somehow? But in addition to the consumer angle, I could point out the regulatory angle. So we have bodies in the government like the FTC, which are charged with helping enforce consumer privacy. In the status quo, if this is the information they have, then that's not working because reading these documents is not scalable, even if you know what's going on. There are also public policy angles to this too, where there are think tanks and other organizations who want to know how data practices are changing over time. And again, the assessment in this form, it's just not scalable. So we want something different. We want to be able to bridge the gap between texts like this, which we have in the status quo, and other kinds of things that are easier for people to process in their day-to-day lives. And a common metaphor that folks have used is the idea of a privacy nutrition label. So this, for example, this comes from not my work. This comes from Lori Craner's lab at CMU, where her group has been working on these visualizations that help people understand at a glance what information is being collected from them and how it's being used. And this one here, this is from Opt Out Easy. This is a web browser plugin I'll talk about later on. So the question becomes, how do we go from text in natural language, which is messy, it's ambiguous, it's got all these weird little quirks to it that mean we can't process it like a programming language, over to something that requires very formal knowledge. And fortunately, we have this field called natural language processing, which I've been lucky to be part of for a while. And I think back to how it was discussed when I was a grad student, and now this is an incredible change. Anyway, here's the basic idea then. We could then start with privacy policy text in the raw form that you get from the internet that you and I look at. We can then use some forms of manual and automatic analysis and some machine learning to extract from natural language the details that people actually might be interested in, the sort of things that policymakers and regulators also would find engaging and useful too. So that's an overall vision which I've been part of basically since I was a postdoc forward. And what I put on the slide here are 3 different NSF projects that I've received funding for. So I was a postdoc under this and then got a subcontract from it, the Usable Privacy Policy Project. This work happened largely at CMU, also at Fordham University and a few other places. And this work gave birth to the first privacy policy corpus. If you're not familiar, a corpus is a collection of text that we can use to train machine learning algorithms on to extract information from text automatically. Part of that was a thing called the OP 115 corpus, Online Privacy Policies set of 115. And that was a relatively small corpus, but it contained lots of human effort. We had law students read privacy policies and make phrase-level annotations to figure out what they meant. So after that, I've been engaged in 2 other projects. One is to build question answering systems that you could interactively sort of have conversation with to understand privacy practices. And then this most recent one, this is Privacyr. This is an SATC Medium grant that I'm lead PI on, where we're focusing on scale. We want to build corpora of large numbers of these documents, millions of documents to train modern NLP models on. So if you're interested in any of the stuff I'm talking about, 2 websites to look at. One is privacyr.ist.psu.edu. That's going to show up a few times, but also usableprivacy.org. right? So I mentioned a few things that are relevant now. One, NLP has changed a lot over the past 10 years. We've gone from a focus on what we now call classical machine learning to deep learning. We've gone from a focus on manual annotations of data, getting lots of people to annotate, well, this word is important, this word is not, to using methods that take in a large amount of unlabeled data and from that make inferences. So Privacyr is a project that focuses on that change to apply it to this work on privacy policies. One of the big things that we did early on is we wanted to build a corpus of as many of these documents as we could. Right. So I'm showing you this progressive filtering process here. We started with Common Crawl. If you're not familiar, it's a corpus of URLs from the World Wide Web. Just something that originally to me I thought was so abstract, like why would this ever have a purpose? Well, it turns out if you want URLs of privacy policies, just search that for privacy, and you've got a pretty good start. So we started with that. We did some progressive filtering. In the end, ended up with the first set of Privacyr documents was 1 million web privacy policies, which at the time was larger than every other privacy policy corpora in the world combined. And now we're up to, I think, 3.1 million. We've not released that yet, but I'm hoping we'll do that soon. So that's a lot of raw material for modern NLP to make inferences out of these documents. And if you want to use that data for something, you can download it at privacyr.isc.psu.edu/data. We released 2 versions of the corpus. One of them is the test drive version with only something like 10,000 documents. The other one, I'll warn you, it's like the large version is like tens of gigs of data. So be careful before you unzip that. It's text, so it compresses really easily. If you want to interact with that a different way, you can try our search engine. So this project is a collaboration between Lee Giles, who's a search engine guru, and myself. He's interested in turning this into a search problem. So you can go to our search engine and search privacy policies. If this sounds completely uninteresting, what I'd suggest is search for something that you hope would never appear in a privacy policy ever, and see if it shows up. Because pretty often in a set of 1 million of these documents, you'll find something pretty weird. I will add the caveat, some of the documents that ended up in this filter, there are some documents that are not privacy policies, they're just websites or news articles that talk about privacy, but you can find some interesting things here. You can also filter that set based on the industry, on tracking technologies, on reading level. So Flesch-Kincaid reading level, if you're not familiar, that's an automated metric for determining basically what level of US education you need to be at to understand some text. It makes a lot of assumptions. It's not perfect, but a result we've seen several times in this work is you basically need to be a sophomore level college student before Flesch-Kincaid says you're ready to understand privacy on the internet. So maybe all of us qualify, but it is difficult. Right. So we gathered this, and we're able to do with this some examinations of the state of privacy online that weren't possible before. One of them was to determine how available privacy policies are. It's the case that legislation in many jurisdictions around the world requires websites to have these in a sort of de facto sense. You need to have some kind of privacy notice. Nearly all websites are subject to that. But the question we wanted to ask is, well, how many of them actually do have it? We found in a study of 5.5 million domains that only about 34% of them had a privacy policy linked on the landing page. So that's a lot of non-compliance if you're thinking in terms of law and GDPR and California's laws, et cetera. So we had some neat other results with that. We did a manual examination of 250 domains, found that 13 didn't have a privacy policy in the same language as the landing page. And that's interesting, as typically, well, I'll give you an example to make that more concrete. Let's say you're running a business in France for a French audience, and your only privacy policy is in English. Well, that kind of is barrier. Let's say you're running a business in Ghana. Well, Ghana's not a good example because there's, I think there's plenty of English fluency there. So choose a different European country where English is not as widely spoken. Maybe Central African Republic. Actually, that's not a good example either because they don't have privacy law. But you can think of places, parts of the world where this becomes a serious equity issue. We can take that even further though. In the big set here, 5.5 million, we found that 2,858 websites had privacy policies in Latin, like classical Latin, the kind you learned in high school. Can anyone guess what the first two words, this is sort of a trick question, privacy policy in Latin, what are the first two words you think we found on that? Do we have any graphic designers here? That's a clue. Lorem ipsum. If you're not familiar, lorem ipsum, those are the first two words of a tract. I forget its origin in maybe antiquity. That text is used as placeholder text for graphic design if you don't actually have the text you want to put in yet. So a lot of these policies, they were just placeholder text. Something I want to do with our group is actually go back through and see if any of those really were privacy policies written in Latin and not lorem ipsum. We've not done that yet. Oh, and I want to point out, for the sake of the students in the room, so this paper, the Zoom bar cuts off the last line here. This paper won the Best Paper Award at DocEng this year. Oh, sorry, Best Student Paper Award at DocEng. That's neat, but this is actually the paper's third submission to an archival venue. And the one before it was a rejection from a prominent journal. They desk rejected it 376 days after submission. We kept asking them for updates and they kept telling us, just wait. I won't tell you where that was, but if you've not seen that before, if you're new to publishing research, these things happen. Right. So we're also interested in when these documents are updated, because frequent updates or having a recent document is a sign that an organization is actually paying attention to disclosure of their practices, that they're interested in transparency. If they have one of these documents that's something like 10 years old or more, as we'll see, that's a sign that the information they posted might be stale, right? So yeah, and some privacy laws require these to be updated on a regular basis. It is often the case that it's more about making sure what you post is accurate to what you're doing, but that's still an important thing. So we used some simple methods, actually worked well for this. We retrieved dates from privacy policies using regexes, and we divided them in categories using PriveBird. So we separated out dates in these documents that indicated when they were last updated or when they were effective from, because that might be different from last updated, and then a few other dates as well. Putting together those two methods, we managed to get some very pleasant scores here with F1. So F1's 0.96, 0.97, et cetera. So this turned out to work pretty well. And what we can do then is we can visualize how often these documents are updated. So left side here, oh, and these are privacy policies we collected from the web between May 2019, March 2021. Left side is the distribution of dates we found in privacy policies. Right, so we've got a histogram here. You can see a big spike here in 2017. We think this is related to GDPR. That seems pretty reasonable. Some other big spikes here. This is probably legislation related as well. We did notice a long tail here where we have some dates in these documents going all the way back to 2002. Not yet looked at that manually, but I'm very curious what website still has dates going back that far. Right side here is relationship between percentage of policies that have a date and PageRank score. PageRank, if you're not familiar, this is an algorithm that Google uses to determine how prominently a website should appear in your search results. So high PageRank means pretty important site, put it pretty high up. And it's calculated basically by the number of links that point to it, though it's more complicated than that. So we found this intuitive link. I'll tell you why it's intuitive in a minute, at least why I think it is. You might have a different interpretation between page rank and likelihood that a policy has a date in it, right? So what that tells us is more popular sites are more likely to actually have some evidence of liveness in these documents. So my interpretation is that more prominent sites are more likely to be run by larger organizations or organizations that are paying attention to their legal obligations. And so they're more likely to put dates in their documents, whereas other sites, small businesses that may struggle with compliance for various reasons, they're struggling to do this as well. Right? So those are findings that affect sort of the big landscape of studying information exchange online in legal sense. We've done some work also that's more consumer facing, where we've taken results of examining these documents using NLP, and we built consumer facing tools. One that I want to point out here is a web browser plugin called Opt Out Easy. You can find this on the Chrome Web Store. I think it still works for Firefox also. But basically what it does is it puts a little icon amongst your browser extension icons that rides along with you as you browse the web. And when you visit a site that we have data for, so it keeps a local copy of some of our text annotations in the plugin. When you visit a site that we have data for on its privacy policy, it shows you your options for opting out of data collection. So instead of having to search through the text of a privacy policy, which none of us do, we already acknowledge that, this just tells you at a glance, well, you can opt out of analytics, click through, and it'll tell you, well, go to this site, click on this document, and you're done. Opt out of analytics, marketing emails, other choices you can make. So using some of our earlier results on detecting types of statements in privacy policies, we can make this possible. We can distill text down to simple instructions like go here, do this thing. We also made some effort towards gamifying this. So your icons change color when you've made a choice. And we're continuing to experiment with this and roll it out further. One more thing on the privacy part of my research I'll tell you is about privacy law. So there's a landscape of privacy legislation like around the world that companies have to deal with. And GDPR has helped us in many ways because it sets such a rigid standard and it's inspired privacy laws from other parts of the world too. But regardless, there's this patchwork. We thought, well, why don't we directly study the patchwork with NLP? So what we did was we built a language resource just out of privacy laws, and we collected 1,043 national level privacy laws from around the world. Mostly national level because we did put in California's privacy law because it's so influential. We put in GDPR, which is multinational, and a few others like that. So I like maps, and I asked one of my PhD students, well, make me a map of the number of privacy laws per country, acknowledging that quantity itself is not quality. You can have lots and still, have problems, but who's passing a lot of legislation? What could we see in that? And we did see a few things. Right, one of them right here, Turkey has the most documents in the world in our corpus. It's 54 of them. And we get geopolitical observations out of examining text this way. Why did Turkey have so many? Well, we looked at when they were passed. They were passed in 2016 after an attempted coup. And our hypothesis, we want to talk with some poli-sci folks to confirm this. Our hypothesis is a lot of those were associated with national security after a coup. I'll point out also, I mentioned, let's see, your Central African Republic is white here. A number of countries here are these colors that indicate we have no data on them. That could be one of two different reasons. That could be because they have no privacy legislation. There is also the possibility that their laws are not available online, which introduces some different sort of issues in terms of whether if you're a company that wants to do business there, well, how do you know you're in compliance right now? That's pretty difficult because you can't find this information online. So we studied this data historically also, right? We plotted here this histogram of number of privacy laws passed per year. You can see the orange one is the number per year, the blue is cumulative. Our first document in this corpus, 1872, it was a law about privacy in British-controlled India that is amazingly still considered to be law. It survived Indian independence, it's still there. But you can see also this dramatic upward trend since about the 1960s, and you could perhaps think about that in terms of what technologies were being adopted at the time. So in the US, credit scores, I believe, started becoming a much bigger thing around the 1960s, 1970s. More recently, you can see the highlight here. We zoom in for 2000 to 2020, and you can see the amount of attention that governments have paid to privacy has increased exponentially. So getting back to the privacy is dead, privacy is not dead. From here, I think we can see that in terms of public policy and governments, privacy has become a big concern. And where that's coming from, you can debate it, but what happens here affects how we interact with technology. So even whether you like it or not, that is something that's being regulated to an extent that it wasn't not long ago. Right. So I showed you that big circle slide. A lot of that was in the privacy NLP overlap. I'm going to focus now on something that's firmly in the NLP side. We'll talk about language model biases. Right. To introduce this, I'm going to step way back in NLP and talk about some fundamental stuff. Frequently, NLP is about language models. If you're not familiar with language models, think of them as statistical representations, maybe in like big statistical tables of the likelihood of sequences of words in text. I use tables here lightly because those of us who are engaged in machine learning know that neural networks do all these different things. But a simple example to think about this, we have something kind of sort of like a language model in our heads. If I read you text and have you fill in a blank, you'd probably be able to do it if I gave you the sense, it's cold outside, so be sure to wear a warm. And everyone's probably thinking coat or jacket or something similar. You're not thinking toaster, you're not thinking MacBook Air, you're not thinking stove even, that's a warm thing. So we have some ideas, humans, how language fits together. And what we have in machine learning and NLP are language models. And there's jargon that's come along with those in recent years. So LLM, that means large language model. Large here is very poorly defined, and it's going to change, I think, every several years. PLM, that's pre-trained language model. These have become a really big deal because there are certain companies and organizations like OpenAI and like Google that have massive computing resources. And with those, they can build huge language models that researchers or individuals just couldn't ever manage. So we're seeing an increasing trend in NLP where PLMs are being used to do research. These are models that we as researchers might not have had a hand in putting together, but they're helping us get stuff done. Same thing is happening in industry, where they're not necessarily building their own language models anymore. They're borrowing something off the shelf, right? So when I talk about training, though, we as humans get training just by living, by talking with folks, right? So our parents talk with us, and they start with baby talk, which actually has some neurology, some value in development of our brain. So we get this by living. If you want to train a language model in machine learning, you have to give it large amounts of text. And the internet's a great source for large amounts of text because people keep writing stuff. Just broadly speaking, no, people keep writing stuff, right? So that's great, but that raises some questions. What happens, how does the behavior of an LLM or PLM reflect the input that we give it, the training data we give it? And so it seems logical that, if people on the internet, on Wikipedia, on Reddit, et cetera, Twitter, there's some core sites that ChatGPT seems to have been trained on, and those are some of them. If people are writing on those sites with biases for or against certain demographics, well, could that mean that PLMs trained on that data inherit those same biases, right? And so when I speak about biases here, I'm talking about socio-demographic biases like associations. One form of this is sentiment bias, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. Seeing certain groups, such as genders or races, as having more positive sentiment than others, or also frequency bias as well. If women are mentioned more often in one profession and men were mentioned more often in another profession, well, could we see results of that in LLMs? And plenty of folks have been investigating this, actually. Answer is an unsurprising yes, but we'll dive into that. We dove into that using a specific lens, though. We did that using sentiment analysis. So I'll give you another brief primer of sentiment analysis. This is the task in NLP. We're trying to determine the emotion of a piece of text, where emotion is typically represented on a scale of something like 0 to 1 or -1 to 1, where you can sort of intuitively think of the negative end as being more angry or upset or sad or just not satisfied or something like that. Positive end here, so yeah, sure, everything is great. And we as humans know this is an oversimplification for how emotion works. It's highly multidimensional, but we simplify this for the sake of seeing what other people do with language technologies, because this appears in a lot of places. This appears in content moderation on social networks, for example. It's often based on sentiment analysis, right? So computational task, given a piece of text, put it on a scale from, let's say, -1 to 1 about how happy or sad or how supportive or unsupportive it is, right? And you can think intuitively, you get something like, this movie's plot bored me and the soundtrack was terrible. Is that going to be more of a -1 or a 1? It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of towards the end here. Fabulous evening for the awards ceremony. Everyone's dressed in their finest clothes. So we're being the human annotators right now. We're expecting computers to do the same job. Our hope is that the computer would end up over here at the +1. So that's the basic idea of sentiment analysis. And what we can do is use that task. We can both examine that task directly for artifacts of bias, and we can use that task to examine others for artifacts of bias. By the way, for folks who are interested in NLP, this is often the gateway topic. A lot of folks, their first NLP project is to do sentiment analysis on some text, right? So I'll tell you about 2 of our works in this direction. One of them was a Trust NLP paper. This is in the workshop earlier this year. Another backstory for students. This one, best short paper award at the workshop. This is the 9th submission for the manuscript. It took a while. Second one there, this was in Coling last year, and I'll tell you about these in sequence. Right. So we decided to examine the effects of words related to disability on sentiment scores from pre-trained sentiment analysis models. Let me unpack that. Remember, I told you about PLMs, pre-trained language models. So there are pre-trained sentiment analysis tools that you can download and just use off the shelf to determine the sentiment of pieces of text, towards applications like, examining whether product reviews are good for your product or not, or what people think about some issue on Twitter, or doing political analysis, stuff like that. So these are widely used both by researchers and by folks out in industry to do things. Well, the question becomes, are these sentiment analysis models biased for or against groups? And we had this hypothesis, well, it might be the case that they're biased against terms for disabilities because they're associated with certain other terms, whether rightfully or not. So to examine this, what we did was we took some popular sentiment analysis models and we fed them a bunch of templated sentences to determine what kinds of scores they generate. I show you an example of the template here. The description word, noun, verb, mask, and I'll fill that in. The description word here for each of these sentences was from this selection. We got this from a few different authoritative sources on disability language. The noun after that was person, woman, man. We did try some non-binary specifiers. The pre-trained language models didn't work well with those because they're relatively rare in text, different form of bias. Verb here was top 100 connecting words in English language. So words like is or were or has, like that. So put together a set of those and you get most of the way to a sentence that we can put in a sentiment analysis tool and get a sentiment score from. But I've not told you about the mask word. Right? So we used mask, we used BERT to fill in the blank here. So a little bit of change to what I was telling you, actually. We were generating sentences with BERT and then running sentiment analysis on them. So we asked BERT, this popular pre-trained language model, to fill in the blank with the words preceding it. So a man has changed, it filled that in. The deaf-blind man has died, filled that in. So we generated lots of these sentences, 7,500 of them. Then we used Vader to assess the sentiment of each. And I did make an error when I was describing that. I'll tell you more about evaluating sentiment analysis models directly in a minute. This right now is evaluating biases of BERT. So yeah, we generated these sentences, and we did find those with disability scores ended up with significantly lower scores, or sorry, those with disability words ended up with significantly lower scores than those without. We can quantify this. Score sense, I won't go into details here. It tells us how much the mean sentiment score deviated on average from those in the control group. We found significant differences here. This is with a t-test with an alpha of 0.001. So this was the result we were basically expecting. To run back through that quickly, it turned out that BERT generated significantly more negative sentences for priming sentences with terms of people with disabilities than for non-disabled sentences, right? So what that tells us, if you're generating text with the PLM, there's a pretty good possibility that words relating to disability will result in angrier, sadder, or negative stories than those without words of disability. And so that has downstream applications when we generate text for stuff, right? Second paper, sentiment bias case study number 2. We wanted to look at how these models, well, how the kinds of sentiments that they associate with different parts of the world. Use the term demonyms here. We did a study on country level demonyms. Demonym is a word that specifies national origin, well, not national origin necessarily, basically geographic origin. So country level demonyms, think of words like French or English or Chinese or Malaysian, Australian, etc. These are words that tell folks where something is from, right? Began with the observation that countries around the world aren't equally represented on the internet by population or by sentiment. And so we wanted to see if we could detect biases towards or against demonyms in GPT-2 output. GPT-2, if you're not familiar, this is one of those pre-trained language models that not used as widely as it is, I mean, not used now as widely as it was before, but it's one that was easy to work with, one we could download and run lots of experiments with and tinker with even. So this was 2 more papers, one in AIES and one in EACL. So here's our approach. We use GPT-2 to complete sentences again, right? So we give it a sentence, demonym, South African, Ethiopian, Saudi Arabian, Canadian, Mexican, etc. Choose your part of the world. Those people are blank. And we asked GPT-2 to complete the sentence. This time, the mask could be more than one word. It could be arbitrary number of words. Just tell us a story was basically our approach. And so we generated 100 stories for each of 193 country-level demonyms. So we get a population of stories for each of those demonyms, and then we can use Vader, which is a sentiment analysis tool, to compare the aggregate sentiment expressed towards each country. I'll run back through that quickly. We asked this language model to generate 100 stories for each country specifier. And then for those stories, we can use Vader to get an idea of the sentiment of the stories. We did some manual examination too. And that gets the population of sentiment scores for each country, at least according to GPT-2. So question becomes, how does GPT-2 react to all these different words about nationality? I'm going to show you some examples. I want to state up front, there is, of course, the fact I'm showing you like a few examples on a slide that's different from showing you the big statistical results. But these were some of the sentences that we got out of GPT-2. So first one there, the underlines are the part where GPT-2 took over and generated text for us. First one says, American people are in the best shape we've ever seen, he said. We have tremendous job growth, so we have an economy that is stronger than it has ever been. That seems like a pretty positive sentiment score. Second one, Mexican people are the ones responsible for bringing drugs, violence, and chaos to Mexico's border. See, I feel bad even like speaking that out loud. But that's a negative sentiment score. This one is interesting. This shows GPT-2's lack of coherence, as it starts out pretty positive and then it pivots negative without an explanation for why. This one I guess people would consider positive. So that's the small scale view. If we actually looked at a few of these, but it holds on the large scale also. Right, so we decided to compare sentiment scores to some other variables. Because to the extent that I've told you so far, we just generated a bunch of sentiment scores. What if we looked at correlation between sentiment scores and internet use in countries? And that's what the first table here is. These are numbers from, let's see here, World Bank statistics. High means high percentage of folks use the internet. Low means low percentage. There are a bunch of countries for which we just don't have data. But if you look at the sentiment scores, you can see a rough correlation here where high turned out to have pretty high sentiment, and then there's some descent going on here. We got a more substantial effect when we looked at economic status. So this is per capita GDP compared to sentiment score. And here we saw that higher average income roughly correlated with higher sentiment. So think back to how this text is, how these models are being trained. It's from how people talk on the internet. Here's the result when you build a language technology based on how people talk on the internet. It sort of talks like the internet. For sometimes good, but for sometimes bad also. Here's the bad. Right? We did some lexical examination also. So countries, you can see the countries with the most positive sentiment scores. Those are France, Finland, Ireland, San Marino. That's an interesting one. That's a micronation, and I believe it's in Italy. United Kingdom also did pretty well. Negative sentiment scores, Libya, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Tunisia, South Sudan. And you can see these were the top adjectives that appeared in the sentences that we generated using this procedure. We put in purple ones that stood out as having sentiment to human annotators, or particularly negative sentiment. Right, you can see more of these negative sentiment scores for these countries down here. And one last thing I asked, so Pranav was the lead author on this, to generate for us a map. I really want to see what this looks like in terms of geography. I like maps. So here's a map of our sentiment scores for the world. And this turned out to be really interesting to me because it's a little bit more complicated than I expected. What I initially expected before looking at this was something that would result very like European and US hegemonic view of the world, where all the positive sentiment scores would be there and maybe like not so much anywhere else. But something else happened, actually. China had one of the most positive sentiment scores in our results. And that's interesting. You do see some usual suspects here and there. So we've got some dark red for Libya, Sudan, Ukraine was kind of orange. Iraq, there's a dark red. That is likely an artifact of discussions in Newswire and in social media about political strife and war in those places. So that's reflected here too. But yeah, China ended up super positive, and we don't know why yet. We're going to look into that. Right. So at this point, I want to switch to some research vignettes. These are shorter stories that I want to cover on projects that sort of getting started on, I think are kind of interesting. Overall observation, though, this guides a lot of my work, that language is this common medium we have for sharing personal information. Sharing any kind of information, sure, but privacy is relevant here. And a lot of other topics are too. Language model biases are relevant here. Language model can't be biased against you unless it knows something about you. So this is a connection with NLP that I think's not been as studied as it could be. So I'll share these two vignettes. One's on socioeconomic status and privacy on Twitter, and the other is on law enforcement radios and privacy, which sounds really weird until I get into it. I'll explain what it is in a minute. Right. So this project started with a report that I read out of Data and Society, this nonprofit think tank, where they studied how socioeconomic status correlates with certain attitudes or beliefs about privacy. They found that people in low socioeconomic status, in the US at least, so less education, less income, they have greater concerns about possible harms caused by online data collection. And at the same time as that, they have lower confidence in understanding privacy-related information. So more worries about what's happening to their data, but less of a sense they can actually do anything about it. So here, privacy becomes an equity issue, becomes a sort of a privilege that you know what to do when you feel like you're being respected. We decided to study that relationship in a different way. This is survey-based data, where they had people fill out a surveys who wanted to study socioeconomic status and privacy in situ and how people use online social networks. So we did that. I will tell you the story in a way that sounds underwhelming at first, and then tell you the version that also happened as a result. The underwhelming version, the contrast I think is interesting. The underwhelming version is we ran a user study on Twitter, 125 participants, gave them an entry survey that asked them a bunch of questions that revealed to us things like income and education level. And we collected their tweets as well to see how much they shared and their reflections on their sharing also. We asked them afterwards, did you know you shared this? Do you think you shared that? The underwhelming part was SES, socioeconomic status, didn't actually appear to affect the volume or types of personal disclosures. This initially was a negative result. We did observe some significant differences in disclosure based on gender and education. Education, though, is part of socioeconomic status. There's a more complex relationship that I can't get into right now. But this was enough of proof of evidence, proof of concept, that NSF has given us an SATC small grant to study the main topic here, privacy and socioeconomic status. There's more to be dug into, I think, because we're seeing, if not in this setting, in other settings, correlations in how much people share and where they are if they're data sharing. Right. Second one, law enforcement communications and privacy. This is a project that actually a college roommate who's now also working in academia brought to me, called me up one day. I've got this idea. I need someone who works with language. What can we do? It's this neat thing that happens once in a while. So begin with the observation, police use radios to communicate. In many places, their transmissions are unencrypted, and there are practical reasons for that because departments want to be interoperable, because the technology that police use for radio communications, it's not evolving as fast as their iPhones. There's not as much technological or financial incentive. But what that opens us to is we have this lens for viewing policing, and we can see what privacy risks this poses for people who the police encounter and whether those risks are unequally distributed. Because of my colleague's background, we decided to focus on race, but we collected lots of demographic data from these transmissions, right? So we're studying audio transcriptions. Well, let's say in my end of the project, we're studying text transcriptions of police radio activity in the Chicago metro area. We have large volume of transcripts of what police say to dispatch and what dispatch says to them. And part of their day-to-day work, they talk a lot about people they encounter. And so we can use that as a lens to examine policing. And we found ramifications both for privacy and equity. Left side here, we've got a graph of personal health information categories that are shared by the police and which are thus basically anyone can hear them. We find that geography is commonly discussed, and that makes a lot of sense. When a police officer makes a stop, he's going to tell dispatch where he is, that's sure. We also found, though, lots of names, vehicle identifiers, health information about people. Dates of birth sometimes appear. We found some government identifiers like driver's licenses. We did find one social security number. That was kind of alarming. It is just one. I go back and forth on that. On the race side, though, we did find a huge disparity in how often different racial groups are talked about by police, where Black folks are significantly overrepresented compared to other groups here living in the Chicago area. If you looked at the distribution of race ethnicity in Chicago, it would not look like this. It would look very different. So what we're doing right now in analysis is putting these two things together to examine differing amounts of privacy vulnerability, and hoping to be able to share more about this soon. Right. So before I wrap up, once again, for the students in the room, thanks for the introduction again. I do run this Advice for Students site, which I welcome people to read. I talk about a bunch of different things. If you're nervous about interacting with faculty, I've got some ideas on how to do that. If you're having difficulty coping with high expectations, that's something that I've written about. If you want to get involved in research, if you've never been to a conference and you want to know what they're like, I think they're really interesting things. I also write some about how to get involved towards applying for a job in academia. And there's some autobiographical stuff on there too. Yeah, so thanks to my sponsors also. A lot of this was NSF, little of it was NIH, and then some sponsors at Penn State also. And these graphics I used a few times in my presentation, they're actually all from DALL-E. If you look at my slides, this one, I gave it natural language processing for privacy and social good. And this is what it produces. Right. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Let's thank the speaker, but first we have to go through the questions. I assume you have a lot of questions.
Thank you for the presentations. It was an interesting talk. So I'll just get the elephant out of the room. So given the
Oh boy, what's the elephant? Whoa.
given the large language model, how are you thinking about privacy in NLP?
Okay. Tell me a little bit more what you're asking. LLMs do pose privacy risks, I guess, but are you thinking of something in particular?
Mainly, I am thinking about like people are interacting with LLMs a lot more than any other models that we have seen, like any other language models. So I think there might be some like personal information revealed, or
I see.
some kind of privacy issues that might be there.
Yeah.
So are you thinking about like implementing some kind of like privacy things?
Well, perhaps. I mean, just to sketch out the problem space, we might be talking about two different related things. One is where these large language models are trained, or what text they're trained on. So if that's text from the web, you can find sensitive personal information in documents online, of course. That's a pretty broad claim, but it's true. And then there are no guarantees that an LLM won't regurgitate it. There have been some efforts to scrub training data and to post-process generated text from LLMs. And there's some success with those, but it's difficult to comprehensively ban something from text. Linguists refer to the generativity of natural language, the fact that you can keep making new sentences, you can keep finding different sequences of words to express the same thing. So that's a fundamental problem, which I think will never be perfect on, but it's worthy of inquiry. There's a different set of problems related to that I've seen discussed, which is in PLMs that are basically web services like ChatGPT. A bunch of people are using ChatGPT, and OpenAI, they state in their privacy policy that they're doing some training based on conversations with it. And I've seen anecdotal examples where people say, well, this is a leaked conversation from someone else. I've not been able to look into that in detail, but it's a thing that can conceivably happen again, because we don't get strict, like, formal guarantees for behavior here. So I can tell you that's something I'm broadly interested in. I guess I'm particularly interested in the consumer-facing aspects of this, where are there ways that we should better caution people to interact with these technologies? Are there ways that we can make the privacy options more usable and understandable for people who have never encountered something like this before? As none of us have, I think. When ChatGPT came out, it blew away like what people thought of NLP for a while. We're starting to recover and realize, well, this isn't completely new, but it is new in some significant ways.
All right, next one. Yeah.
So in terms of the biases you're seeing in the language models that you're using, is the goal, when you see and are able to research these biases, is the goal to try to filter out those biases to get a true representation of what's going on? Or is the goal to work with these biases, since that's actually coming from the data?
Okay, great question. In the efforts that I showed you in most of our work so far, not all of it, our goal is even more modest than that. It's simply to measure and demonstrate those biases are there. And being able to measure them, I think, is an important step towards finding ways to mitigate them. And people have discussed varying approaches. That's where I think my lab's work is going to go next. How do we fix this problem? One approach that's been discussed is filtering of the training data, or somehow generating rebalancing data so it provides a more nuanced perspective. Another approach has been post-filtering of what you generate if it's generative model. I think what we're going to run into, though, is that what we think of as biases, the social aspects of it, that requires a substantial amount of world knowledge to navigate, right? So the machine learning, like the technical definition of bias, that's just that's separate from us determining, well, these words should not appear together. These words are okay. So I see progressive effort in, I think, the post-filtering, incorporating more and more social knowledge to make sure that these models are generating text that's fair and appropriate. But I could be completely wrong, because we're all figuring this out. Oh.
When you see these PLMs emerging, something that I do, I work with supercomputing, and we support everybody at Auburn and other places where we're seeing large data sets. And when you say you work with NIH or NSF, do you see the vetting of data sets and PLMs to say, if you're going to do research and you're going to do it for us, here are the pre-vetted models that you can use, and using these sentiment scores, I think that's great to say you can look at a model and you can look at these attributes of the model, and where they would say, here are the approved models that you can use, because others are going to have poison training data that's going to be injected into them, and it's going to skew that model. My interest is we already store a whole lot of stuff, petabytes of stuff, and this is going to accelerate where we're going to have to know what models we have to store and pre-stage for people to use, so they don't have to download them.
Okay, yeah, the operationals aspect of this, that's a neat crossover. Yeah, so we could be we could be talking about compliance in terms of behavior, or we could be talking about, well, basically which model is best, which model displays the fewest bad behaviors. Depending on the direction there, I think we'd have like different discussions. But something overall I've seen talked about is the idea of having sort of nutrition labels for machine learning models, pre-trained models, where you disclose upfront in a standardized format, this is the training data, this is the algorithm, this was the due diligence that was applied to mitigate bias and to prevent the inclusion of sensitive personal information. Here are other caveats. I think that's a really interesting idea, because if we had a standardized representation for that, then we can start to programmatically address concerns like the ones I think you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that from where I sit, there's concern of when you're using these models and you're using your intellectual property against those models. You know, the model wins when the longer, you know, if it's attention-based or whatever it is based on, where instilling confidence in people that when we use a model or when we use Copilot or something from Microsoft that's coming in that says, we have these pre-trained models, we have to assure you that your intellectual property is not being incorporated in with those models it runs, because if the product is made available to us and we don't pay for it, you know, there's a saying on the internet, if you don't pay for the product, you are the product.
Yeah.
Which
is a special case of no free lunch.
They learn from what you put in there. We have to make sure that we put stuff in there and it doesn't influence that model and is not taken away as intellectual property to train the model that we've been looking at.
Yeah. And for the sake of other folks, we need to make another distinction here. There are pre-trained language models you can download and interact with privately, not really worry about information leakage because everything's happening locally. But for ChatGPT and Google Bard, that's where these concerns come up, that your interactions with a language model that's being hosted by some other company, chances are they're improving their model using your interaction, which is a privacy issue. I know someone who works at major government agency who tells me that ChatGPT is currently banned for them by IT. Like they banned the domain because they don't want any text from their organization going into it. So how do we navigate that? Well, I am told, I've not personally verified this, that if you pay for ChatGPT, you can turn off some of the analytics options. So OpenAI won't learn quite as much about you. But that is something we need to pay attention to, and that I think these companies could do better disclosing about what's being done with your data. Is that responsive to your comment?
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation.
It is.
Thank you for your.
Yeah, it's a new world.
Thanks. For countries that censor their internet or the topics that appear like on their internet searches, how does that affect like the training and bias of a?
Oh, so you mean for the Demonym results I showed you, I think. Okay, so let's sort of work backward and then work forward. The results I showed you were based on so they're based on GPT-2, which is trained on internet data or text from the internet from a bunch of different sites. The training doesn't know which countries have restricted internet. And those countries are still discussed by other countries, presumably. So what that suggests to me is that for, let's say, North Korea, that might be a good example just to work through. GPT-2 is probably not going to get much text from North Korea from training, but it will get text from Newswire or social media talking about North Korea. So you could say less indigenous representation, more representation from others. for those countries. But I think even for some countries that don't have restricted internet, that might still be the case. Like there's probably plenty of discussion of the US in social media from almost any part of the world. But yeah, there is a difference in balance there, where it's even less representation from the folks who have the demonym and more from everyone else. Yeah,
Right.
that goes back to the internet penetration results I showed. Anyway, go ahead.
It's like a follow-up to that. Do you think that lack of internal representation from those countries might contribute to some of the negative sentiments represented?
I want to say yes, but then I think there's sort of a direct yes and an indirect yes. The indirect is interesting because there's probably a correlation between restrictions on internet and negative perception of a country, given, I guess, given trends in how humanity thinks government should work. We have generally favorable views of democracy, which doesn't smile kindly on restricting internet access, therefore more negative sentiment scores towards restricting internet access. And that's an odd connection to think about, but there it is. That's something in human civilization affecting sentiment scores. Beyond that, we might run into this, I guess that's a follow-up on his question. If a country restricts internet access, then we're only getting input about that country from other countries in GPT-2. I think we end up at the same place as the indirect, that lack of representation gives us a negative perception of a place. Yeah. But yeah, I wonder now, we looked at internet use penetration. I forget the exact term. Basically, how many people use, what percentage of people use the internet in a country. We did not look more directly at maybe something like freedom metrics, which might be more correlated with that, like freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Someone's probably quantified that, and we could plug that in and see correlations as well. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Are there any questions online?
No, I think there are two thank you notes from online, people online. But I have a last question, I guess. So very interesting talk, not because this is just interesting, also because I tried to do something that is very connected to this. So here is my question. So oftentimes I have some particular service I need, and there are only a selected set of providers that provides the service.
Yeah.
Now, if I look at an aggregate statistic over like different services and all that, that portrays a picture like, well, something is right or something is going wrong. But then given a particular set of choice, like very restricted, like 2-3 service providers that can provide the service for me, how about comparative analysis between the two services? Maybe they are not perfect, but I want to make a decision like this is better than that. And have you done any kind of comparative analysis? Because that's what I tried to do. I'm still trying to do.
Okay, yeah. So you're speaking, just to rehash, you're speaking as basically as a consumer considering two possible service providers, and it sounds like you're concerned about privacy. You'd like to be able to compare them. There's been some prior work on this. There's a group called TOSDR, which stands for Terms of Service Didn't Read. It's this, they have a website where they crowdsource annotations to privacy policies in terms of service agreements and other documents, and they give them scores, or they give them grades, sorry, like A through F. There's some other weird letter in there, where A is supposed to be the most friendly to the consumer and F is supposed to be the least friendly. Those scores go beyond privacy to some other dimensions as well, but sort of a broader umbrella of an idea. There's an appeal to reducing this to just like one letter. So I'm gonna like go through the pros and cons, but on the other hand, we do. There's lots of research that's established how personal privacy, where some people are fine with sharing their data with the world. Some people no, share nothing, not even IP address. So I think a lot of what I'd seen suggests that the personal part of this makes this even more complicated. which is not to say we couldn't build that kind of tool. I think that's a really interesting idea to do comparisons between privacy documents, even if we're not reducing it to choose this instead of that. Well, what are the differences at least? What I'd love to do, maybe on the next grant, is take some of this work towards large language models approaches to privacy policies and merge it with some prior work towards formal understanding of these documents, because that's going to be necessary if we're talking about concrete privacy practices. We can't just treat it as statistical text. We have to really pin down, this is shared, this is not. I think that would be interesting to do, maybe as the next stage.
All right, let's thank the speaker again. So we still have 15 minutes, like if you want to personally say hi to Dr. Wilson, he will be here. But and then we will go out for lunch, and he has got like individual lab visits in the afternoon after the lunch. So students most like, and like all of you, like if you want to personally talk to him, say hi, this is the time. You have 15 minutes. All right, people on Zoom, thank you very much for joining, and we'll be signing off. Thanks.